We live in BC because we have mountains and streams and clean air and clean water and wildlife that we can go experience.
One regards these giant Douglas firs of British Columbia's forest lands and the vastness of their numbers. But today, mere man proceeds methodically about the business of furnishing the world with one of the basic commodities of civilization.
I don't think a lot of people realize the level of influence that we have as a society on wildlife and habitat.
Off she goes, but to the hardy lumberman, they are a grand sight.
When I step back and I look at forests and our ecosystems, there's just been some traumatic events that have happened to our landscapes across BC, and I think that the amount of habitat that's remaining is at a critical level.
Here is sport and the spirit of conquest, as well as money in the pockets of the fishermen.
It's real hard to point your finger on one specific spot, but I mean, there's large-scale changes that we've seen over the past 100, 150 years that have, some of it has been beneficial, some of it has been less beneficial.
Talk about your modern methods. Fish mean money, so it's quite a bagful, worth its weight when the payoff comes.
We get incredible losses of wildlife following the settlement of North America by Europeans. The extinction of the passenger pigeon, the near loss of bison, one of our most iconic animals, even animals that we think of as common today, like deer, becoming really rare.
Huge declines. I've seen it in elk, in mule deer, record low salmon populations, endangered steelhead populations, endangered caribou populations.
I know that we will not have what we have now if we continue down our current path. And what we have now wasn't what my grandfather had. I grew up to listening to stories of abundance, which makes me scared because our current status quo within our province is a continual decline within our wildlife populations.
In a generation of people, we have lost what makes BC special.
It's kind of mind-boggling when you really look at it and you start teasing these layers apart and seeing how everything interacts and everything ties together. And there's always a balance to these ecosystems, and if you pull something out, you're going to create this trophic cascade of effects that move down. And you can see these shifts when you remove an iconic or a keystone species. And I think mule deer is one of these species.
I think mule deer are one of those awesome animals that really speak to a lot of different kinds of people. Whether it's watching a mother lead her new fawns down the road in your subdivision, or you're out in the backcountry hiking and you see a big, beautiful mule deer buck step out on a ridgeline and silhouette against the sky. They really evoke emotions in us.
Mule deer occupy this whole landscape. They cover the mountains, they cover the valley bottoms, they cover the alpine.
It's this iconic animal that represents the Okanagan and food sovereignty for the nation.
People depend on them. It's all connected with our families. We'll go out and hunt together. When you're on the trails, you're telling stories, and maybe you're speaking a little bit of the language. And I think if you don't go out, you're losing that aspect of community and family.
I grew up on moose, deer, salmon, and if I lose that, I lose my way of life. That community piece that you can feel part of is super important.
They're such a beautiful animal. They're a part of us.
For us to be healthy and for mule deer to be healthy, it requires us both to be in a good place. One of our biggest fears that we have with mule deer, we're seeing a steady onset decline across Western North America, specifically within the Okanagan Nation's territory, my nation's territory.
Mule deer populations in most of Western North America were declining in the early to mid-90s. To this day, we still don't really know what caused that decline, and in some regions they kind of rebounded and came back from that. But here in southern interior BC, it seems like the populations have either stayed low or they're continuing to decline to this day. And because of all the changes that have happened in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we really don't know what's causing this decline.
Some of the early writings talk about many herds of 40, 50 deer roaming the valleys. You just see them routinely, and now, you're lucky if you see a few when you're driving around.
We've definitely seen a change in the wildlife populations. Most areas in British Columbia, you could talk to hunters, they're going to say that the wildlife populations have dramatically changed over their lifetimes, and it's not for the better.
And what we've seen in a number of cases is that the harvest has declined by over 90%. Mule deer mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but at the end of the day, they're a reflection of how well we're taking care of our environment. That's the question, is what do you want BC to look like? If we look over our shoulder, we know that means going from abundant to threatened to at risk to endangered to extinct. We're living it with steelhead and caribou. We're living it with salmon right now. If we continue down the status quo road, that means mule deer will be one of those species that ends up on that list. And the question for people, is that what you want BC to look like 50 years from now?
Something's really changed, and so our job is to figure out why.
We're a society as a whole that can mobilize efforts to cure very dangerous diseases and put helicopters on Mars. We can figure out how to do better wildlife management in this province. Your average person in British Columbia may not think much about a species like mule deer, and not that many people give them a voice, and that's what we're trying to change. The big picture with the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project is to understand the factors limiting mule deer abundance and then finding pathways to restore their populations.
That's a pretty common story for the start of a project. Animal X is declining. Why? What can we do to stop it? But it's not always an easy question to answer. Maybe mule deer are declining because their food sources are going away. There's not as much high-quality forbs and shrubs out on the landscape.
Maybe the issue has to do with forestries. Maybe it's our stocking standard. Maybe it's our species representative that we're replanting. Maybe it's our replanting structure itself.
Or it could be because there's more predators around for some reason.
There's all these different aspects that can potentially be playing a role.
So we have basically what we would call competing hypotheses, all of these different potential explanations for why mule deer are going away. We then need to bring on people who are really going to take the ideas and run with them and make them come alive.
So my name is Sam Foster, and I'm the go-to camera guy on this project. Game cameras or trail cams are just glorified cameras that you strap to a tree and you can leave outside in all weather conditions, and they just simply snap a picture anytime something moves in front of them. Turns out you can learn a lot from pictures. Every time that a camera gets triggered, the date and time are recorded, the temperature, even the phase of the moon.
And so it's really good at giving you a landscape level picture of all of the different critters and human beings using a landscape. But that's not enough on its own. And so to get to the why there's more and fewer mule deer, we also want to ask what happens for an individual mule deer over the course of its life. And so we actually go out and capture individual mule deer. We put a GPS collar on them, and that collar sends us a relocation every couple of hours.
And so this is amazing because it gives us really fine timescale of movement data.
We kind of get this breadcrumb of locations across the landscape, and we can follow along as that mule deer goes about its life. So by weaving together these two kinds of data, the big landscape data from the cameras, combined with the detailed stories we learn from GPS collars, we can hopefully distinguish what the heck is going on with mule deer and why are they declining.
Project really started when I loaded 150 cameras and a bunch of gear into the back of my truck. And I made my rounds across 30,000 square kilometers to meet with all sorts of different folks in parking lots. I then doled out gear to them, trying to track who has what.
We've got everybody from retired folks, young families, hunters, hikers, all wanting to help our BC wildlife improve. It's a lot of work, but they're people that believe in the project.
And so I coordinate a team of now over 200 volunteers. We have 150 cameras. They move twice a year.
We've got people out traveling long distances by very unmaintained roads.
We selected our camera sites using a computer algorithm that surveyed areas that had a high percentage of logging, of wildfire. This computer took our request and gave us a whole bunch of spots on the map. Lo and behold, some of them are quite challenging to get to when a computer is behind the wheel.
You basically get a GPS coordinate, and they want you to go to that location, find a deer trail or a well-used game trail, lock it to a tree, and we walk away and hope that it's there when we get back, either in 6 months or 12 months.
Over the last 3 years, we've caught close to 400 deer and put collars on them.
So how do you get a GPS collar on a deer? Well, it depends.
We've been capturing animals, I guess, 4 different ways. One is with helicopter neck gunning. That's how we initially got our hands on the adult females, and we've been using it also for juveniles in all of the study areas.
You can dart them, what I call catch and release hunting, usually into the rump of the animal, and that animal then goes to sleep. And while it's sleeping, you measuring it, checking it over to make sure it's healthy, putting that collar on, and then giving it another round of veterinary drugs that makes it wake up. One of the primary tools we use in this project is what's called clover trapping. We put bait inside, often alfalfa or apples, and the deer goes inside, clover trap closes, and we are then able to go in, put a blindfold on, and again, put that collar on really quickly. You know, mule deer die. We can actually get a signal from the GPS collar that mule deer has stopped moving. Those breadcrumbs just kind of stack up in space. And we go out and actually investigate, well, okay, it's like a crime scene. Who killed this? Was it a cougar? Was it a wolf? Was it a human hunter?
We had a deer die on Wednesday, an adult female. Try to get there as fast as we can. We can figure out what killed the deer, but it might be kind of tough because it's summertime, so there's a lot of scavengers out there, and also a lot of decomposition happens pretty quickly when it's this hot outside. We have to be really careful walking in because there's more than likely going to be bears in the area. It's feeding a lot of animals right now, would be my guess. Ready? Okay, away we go. We're coming. Maybe it's this way. Well, I like to think if there was a bear here, they would have left. Oh, here's my collar, just sitting out by itself. You can see some bite marks on it. That would be from whatever ate this gal. She's a goner. When we get to the carcass, we try our best to figure out what is the likely cause of death of the deer. Oh, you're right, there is a job. Definitely been a lot of scavenging, so maybe we'll just take a cruise around and see if we can find any other parts of the deer here. We have the top jaw. It'd be nice to find a bottom jaw and a long bone. There's a bunch of characteristic ways that these predators kill deer. So cougars, for example, they'll cache or they'll cover up their prey. So if you think of your cat in a litter box covering their poop, they kind of do that with the carcass of the deer. Whereas the coyotes and wolves, they're pretty messy predators. They tend to have a whole pack come in, and there will be limbs and coyote poop and stuff like that scattered over a really large area. Okay, perfect. The only other thing that would be nice to find would be a femur, and then that we can look at bone marrow fat later, and that'll tell us a rough estimate of body condition at death. This one, unfortunately, there's just been a lot of scavenging in the last 2 days, so this will have to be called an unknown because there's just no way we can tell exactly what killed this deer. So.
The easiest way to get a collar on a deer is to collar them when they're a fawn. When deer fawns are born, their primary strategy in life is to hide. When they are lying still in a patch of vegetation, they are almost impossible to see, and they spend the first couple weeks of their life just really staying very still, and then every few hours, mom comes back to nurse them. So the nice thing is, if you can get your hands on them when they're that little, they just sit there and let you put a collar on them, a really, really small collar.
Every year in each study area, we try to maintain a sample size of 30 adult females. So that doesn't mean we're collaring 30 adult females every year. We add to that each year just as they die. But then every year we do want to have 20 juvenile deer collared per year. And then since deer age, obviously you have to catch more juveniles every single year. In late May and early June, that's when mule deer in this region give birth. During that time frame, we actually change the female collars to take a location every hour. And then we look at these hourly locations every morning and every evening, and we look for these characteristic tiny little clusters of locations to say, okay, I think this deer has given birth.
So we know 7-7's good.
She had a baby, for sure.
Bit of a drive.
Yeah, probably take all day. Pretty positive we're gonna find a deer.
Spots on 3.
Spots on 3.
1, 2, 3.
Spots. There we go.
So we walk in these transects back and forth, and we basically are just having our eyes on the ground the whole time, looking for those neonates. The deer at this age, their main anti-predator strategy is just to sit still and be as quiet and noiseless as possible. So they can be really hard to find. Today, especially, it's super hot out, so I would be shocked if we just found them right out in the open. They'd definitely be tucked like under a log or under, just like a little shrub, bush, anything to stay out of the sun. We're maybe like 30 meters from that last point that came in.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the main cluster is back this way, and her last point we kind of walked through already, but I think there's still some more above us, so they're out there.
Just got lucky. We finally found them after an hour and a half.
We put our gloves on. That's the number one thing we do first, because we're trying not to transfer any scent between us and the deer. The first thing we do is we weigh the deer.
4.23.
We want to make sure that that collar doesn't weigh more than 3% of their body weight. If the deer doesn't weigh enough, then we won't put a collar on that deer. And then we take a couple other measurements, and then we let it go. So we don't do any of the more invasive stuff like we do with the adult deer. We don't draw blood, we don't put an ear tag in. We're mostly just interested in how much does it weigh, and then putting that collar on so that we can follow its movements, hopefully for a very long time. I've never been so glad to see a fawn. We fought hard for this one. It's a struggle. Yeah, so in the Okanagan, they're working hard as well, and I think they have 7 fawns, so they're a little behind us, but they'll catch up. And yeah, I'm just excited to see if survival is the same as it was last year, or if there are a lot of differences between the 2 years.
So we drive out to the site. I've got a pretty fixed location. The collar cluster, the data set is inside of about a 50-meter area. We're on site. We've got a collared doe close by. She's clustered up in the last 48 hours. We have a suspicion that she's given birth. We're gonna move to our last known locations on the collar. Hopefully we'll get our eyes on her, take a couple measurements, put a collar on it. We'll let it go and we'll move on. Chances are if we find one, we will find 2. I feel pretty confident that this fawn's here today. So our cluster is like 200 meters tall and it's say like 130 wide.
Yeah.
So I think what we'll do is we'll base off this road line. We'll go 50 or 70 meters that way. We'll flip in and we'll come back. If that fails, we move into the area. We form up into a grid search. We move back and forth through the area until the fawns are located. Once those fawns have been identified, we'll put on our gloves, we'll cover up. So the first thing we do, you cover the eyes of the animal and it kind of calms them down. Got it. Good boy, good boy. Take our biological samples as efficiently as we can, 20 even. Get that collar on it, pull back to allow that doe to come back in and pick up her fawns as quickly as she can.
And we were able to uncover that she had 2 fawns, so it was a successful day.
collars that we have on the fawns will give us a location every day for the next year, and so we'll continue to track an individual for 2 or 3 years.
A lot of what the science team did in the early days of the project was come up with that strong study design of where we're going to capture deer, where we're going to put our cameras, and soon we're going to actually start analyzing data, which sounds boring, but is so exciting. This is when you learn something new that's never been known before. All those cameras, all those photos, we have to cook them down into actual data that we can do some math on.
The thing that makes this field the hardest is the fact that everything in nature is interrelated. It's not like deer exist in a vacuum by themselves. There's a whole lot of things going on the landscape. Within the first year, we realized that cougars were the #1 predator of deer in all 3 of our study areas. And so that kind of got us wondering what's going on with cougars in these regions.
Is it because they're just simply more of that predator there? Oh, yeah, it's a numerical relationship. There's more cougar kills here because there's also more cougars in the area. But we can also see if there's maybe other interactions happening. Things like there aren't more cougars in this area, but the mortality rate is quite high. So maybe there's something about the landscape that is interacting with that predator to make them more dangerous.
When you put a highway across what is a mule deer migratory corridor, you start breaking up what was migration routes. Wolves and other predators are using roads at a more effective and efficient rate, as do hunters. We have majority of our hunters are hunting off roads. It is that collar data where you see an individual coming to the highway and being negatively influenced and altering a route. Those are the instances of information that we can derive from projects like this.
One of the hypotheses we have is that the lack of forest fires in the last 50 years has actually reduced the amount of mule deer food that's out there on the landscape.
Everything from the grass to the deer and the sheep and the predators that eat deer and sheep, they all evolve with fire.
You might think after a big fire comes through an area that it's just destroyed everything and there's nothing left for the animals, but it actually turns out that the green grass and forbs that grow up after a fire are really high in nutritional quality for deer.
And fire in the Okanagan traditionally was something that came through often, but it was not severe. Get rid of fire, we have all this fuel now that's built up that's sitting on the forest floor. And now when we have a fire, these fires are completely out of control and it ends up burning down people's houses. Quite often we can actually scorch the dirt where it no longer produces enough nutrition to produce plants. I think everyone should be aware that putting out forest fires is not the best thing for our forests, it's not the best thing for wildlife, and it's not the best thing for people.
What has changed in the last 30 years and why are we talking about mule deer now? Well, the habitat has changed. You're seeing massive swaths of habitat being altered by humans. We're hitting at a high elevation through natural resource extraction, and then we're hitting at low elevation through the urban sprawl issue, which historically occupied mule deer habitat that is now turning into pavement and homes, and people are extending into places where they previously weren't.
It's a changed place. All the trees are gone. And the forests that have grown up in the last 30 years in the areas that were previously logged don't make the same type of habitat for animals to survive. They're a monoculture forest that, while it's got good value for the forest industry, has got very little value for wildlife.
So we're in the central Okanagan looking at an interior Douglas fir forest. What we'd expect in this forest is some huge Douglas fir vets, very few small trees, and a really diverse kind of forest floor. So this is one of those old interior Douglas fir trees that we like to see in these forests. What we can see here is a bunch of fire scars. This tree has seen a lot of fires and it's seen a lot of mule deer. It's also stressed because of competition, but when we look up, what we can see is there aren't any branches for the first 30 feet. And this tree now is fireproof. What we can also see when we look out into the forest is outside of the shadow of this tree is a whole bunch of small trees which crowd out the sunlight and they eliminate what is supposed to grow on the ground. This forest should be composed of hundreds of large trees with no small trees, and instead we have hundreds of small trees and very few large trees.
The big picture with biodiversity conservation are invasive species, disease, climate change, and habitat loss. And habitat loss is the big piece, but we don't really know how habitat translates into a population.
Because there's so many different interrelated factors, and to truly figure out exactly what's causing mule deer to decline, you'd have to study almost everything on the landscape, and that's not really feasible, especially when you don't have enough money to do that.
There was a time where BC was considered a world leader in terms of what it was doing for fish, wildlife, and habitat conservation. What we see over time is this shift away from taking care of these resources, and we're putting more money into basically everything else other than natural resource management. If you want to have fish and wildlife and habitat that is functioning and sustainable, you need to invest in it.
People are doing what they can, giving us the shirts off their back to get this project going. And it's inspirational and helps us get the right answers back out to the community so that people can make better decisions.
This takes a community to do this type of research. It's not something that 1 or 2 or 10 people can do. There's a reason we have hundreds of people on this project, and they're really the only reason it's able to happen. You know, they drop everything to go spend their weekend slogging through the bush for this project. It's just an inspiring group of people.
I mean, I love getting out there and hiking in and seeing these great places. I love to see people volunteering. I don't ever want to see that stop. But I also don't want them to be doing the work that we should be funding through government, through our taxes, give them the resources they need to get this work done without having to have a fleet of hundreds of volunteers. BC is known for its wildlife. We need to look after them, and we need to spend the money where it's needed.
Ensuring healthy mule deer is going to ensure not just mule deer for folks to watch and photograph and hunt and enjoy, but also healthy mule deer habitat. Southern British Columbia is really a harbinger for a lot of landscapes across North America and the world. You know, we are increasingly interacting with wildlife much more than we used to be. There's still a lot of unknowns about how that affects wildlife and which species will be the winners and the losers in these human-modified situations. And so if we want to conserve species we care about, we really need to understand how we affect them.
And so I think it's important that we try to give back or try to fix some of those problems if we can. When you're studying ecology and these different species, I feel like we're actually making a difference.
That's something that I take to heart. You know, I've got 2 little children at home and don't want to see things worse off in their future than they are now, that's for sure. At one point, there was caribou all over this landscape, and we think of them as so rare and endangered now. And it's not hard to imagine mule deer heading in that same direction, where we're talking about hanging on to the last bits of, old growth forest or whatever to protect them. And this is the time to make those changes, so we're not talking about, endangered species legislation for something like mule deer.
As a wildlife biologist and as a young person, as a Syilx person, you just see the negative and you just see the issues. However, you have to take a moment and you have to look at who's around you. You have to look to your communities. You have to look to the land. You have to be able to meet those hurdles, and you have to figure out ways around them, and you have to figure out how am I going to better change the landscape to make it a healthy landscape. Because at the end of the day, if our landscape is healthy, our people are healthy. If our wildlife are healthy, we are healthy.
Anything else that we didn't touch on about the trial?
Well, we didn't rank different deer species fawns in order of cuteness, which is one of the primary research questions that I address. It goes Sitka black-tailed deer fawns are the cutest. Mule deer fawns and white-tailed deer fawns would have to duke it out with their tiny hooves. They're both really cute in different ways. Baby moose are okay. Baby pronghorns, they're okay. Baby caribou are kind of over in a category of their own because they have really fuzzy noses, so it's not really fair. They can't they're a different category of competition. The fuzzy nosers versus the non-fuzzy nosers. Yeah, baby bison, pretty cute, right? Yeah, but stick a black-tailed deer, obviously. Yeah. Blue ribbon, 100%, always. I think that's a wrap.